thank you all for coming. It's been a lovely trip. This is the last thing I do in the region. I started in Australia 3.5 weeks ago. I go to the hotel and then fly to Auckland and to Los Angeles. So this is quite a send-off. It's a wonderful way to end what has been an excellent trip. So I was heartened to hear the minister talk about human rights and digital rights. I don't know how at this stage we can talk about digital rights as anything but human rights. When you have a single wire that comes into your house and delivers free speech and a free press and freedom of assembly and access to education and social mobility, employment, tools, civil engagement, political engagement, how can we frame that as anything but a human right? Now, we're at a crossroads on privacy because the internet has these strange dual properties. The digital world has these strange dual properties as pertains to privacy. So on the one hand, we have working cryptography, a genuinely new thing in the world, right? You take that distraction rectangle out of your pocket, you take a picture and you save it to the fully encrypted drive, and if all the hydrogen atoms in the universe were turned into computers that did nothing until the end of the universe but try and guess what key they would need to turn that file back into a photo, we run out of universe long before we run out of keys. So it seems that there's at least some positive implications for privacy to the extent that privacy and secrecy overlap. Your ability to control the destiny of the data that you generate has, on the one hand, never been more powerful. On the other hand, we have the fact that all of our round is conducted over this single wire. And there are many intermediaries that sit between us and the parties we communicate with for whom what used to be considered a kind of nuisance, the buildup of our log files, has become a kind of asset. And we now infinitely retain and manage and mine those, whether it's a spy agency or a corporation or what have you. And it's in the interest of the people who have found power or money or some combination of both in mining those log files to insist that the two are inseparable, as though Moses came down off a mountain with 2 stone tablets saying, "Thou shalt stop rotating thy log files and instead try and figure out how to advertise to people with them." You know, in the ideal world of these people, Mark Zuckerberg spying on you and everyone you know is a regrettable but absolutely necessary, inseparable characteristic of hanging out with your friends on the internet. And you can't have one without the other. And I think that when we discuss privacy, one of the things that's important to do is not lose sight of the benefits that we derive from technologies that compromise our privacy, and instead insist that these two things can be separated, that we can have a live stream on Facebook without having surveillance, and that it is a matter of what technology we demand and what pressure we can put on the systems that we use to deliver the benefits and minimize our costs. We're living through a curious moment in the history of privacy, because historically the role of privacy advocates like me for decades has been to convince people that digital privacy is the thing they should be paying attention to. We absolutely failed. We have been decades at it of failing to convince people that privacy matters. But where we failed, consequences succeeded. In the same way that it took a long time to convince people that the climate mattered until the waves started overtopping their homes, caring about privacy is a thing that comes naturally to you when you've had your life ruined by a privacy breach. And the only thing worse than people's lives being ruined by privacy breaches is if we squander that opportunity. We're living through a moment of peak indifference, the moment at which the number of people who have been directly or closely affected by privacy problems only goes up from now on, in which the job of privacy advocates is transformed from convincing people that they should care about privacy into convincing them that they can do something about privacy. Because from now on, all that carbon we have pumped into our privacy atmosphere will be doing its damage no matter what. It's too late to remove that stuff. Those silos will breach. From now on, our job is to convince people to minimize the silos we build in the future. And so it's fashionable to bemoan teenagers as being indifferent to privacy. I think what you find when you scratch a teenager is that they care very deeply about privacy, but they suck at threat modeling. They think that they need to worry about their parents. They don't realize that they need to worry about the person who they're in love with today, who will hate them with the heat of 1,000 suns tomorrow. Or the employer who will be looking at the stuff that they left behind them in 20 years. Privacy, after all, is not no one knowing your business. Privacy is you choosing who gets to know your business. And we may choose wisely and we may choose poorly, but privacy does not go away just because we made bad choices. It just means we're doing privacy not very well. In an era in which networks mediate everything, there is no way that anyone can be plausibly said to be anti-technology. It doesn't matter how much you dislike technology. Technology is going to be part of how you live your life from now on. And so it's much more useful to be pro-good technology than it is to take some pose of anti-technology. And in the age of the techlash, another thing that's long overdue, I hope that we can direct some of the absolutely deserved anger at how technology is played out into demanding better instead of demanding that it all go away. Now, there are a lot of ways that things can be better. In fact, the space of all the ways we could improve technology is so vast that I'm not even going to attempt to scratch it today. And instead, I'm going to limit myself to a much more modest goal, which is how we can be less wrong, rather than how we can get it right. So privacy is power. All privacy relationships exist in a power model. To be private is to understand what the powerful know about you and how they use it, which means that privacy can only exist when there is privacy for the powerless and transparency for the powerful. Edward Snowden did not violate the privacy of the Five Eyes powers when he told us all how they were spying on us. It is only through having insight into how powerful entities are gathering and using information about us that we can approach some kind of beneficial privacy relationship. And so I would like to propose 3 fundamental freedoms for getting things less wrong, for accomplishing that goal of holding the powerful to transparency so that we can have privacy for the powerless. And these 3 fundamental principles, these 3 freedoms that we need to have, are the freedom to study the systems that surround us, to tell other people what we learn, and to change them if we don't like what we find. You may notice that I've cribbed these shamelessly from the Free Software Foundation, which has these as their core principles. And excuse me, all credit to them for having been at it for 30 years saying just this, and for this prescience that they had. It suddenly we turn around and it turns out that the answer was with us all along. It's like our ruby slippers. So if we want to find out whether or not our data is being well managed, we need to be able to find out whether people who claim to have anonymized it have done so well. Every privacy framework that exists in the world that I know about has some kind of generally beneficial carve-out for releasing data after you've removed the personally identifying information from it. I mean, it would be a very good world if the NHS could take all of its data, remove the information that identifies individuals, and let medical researchers study it to tease out subtle connections between interventions and their outcomes, between causes and effects. But the problem with these carve-outs is that in computer science land, we don't really have an agreed upon methodology for talking about whether or not data has ever been de-identified. We don't really know whether or not there's information latent in a data set that might allow people to re-identify people. And sometimes we get proposals to address de-identification, like we'll just ban re-identification attempts as a means of stopping people from harmfully connecting the dots between someone in an anonymized data set and their real identity. So the real harms that arise from re-identification aren't just that the state might re-identify you openly or that a firm might re-identify you openly and base a product on it. There's also secret re-identification, re-identification by criminals, by spy agencies, re-identification in the form of shadow profiles constructed by firms that they use to market to you without having to ever explicitly acknowledge that they've gathered data on you. And the fact that we have insisted that we not know how re-identification might work does not prevent those harms from arising. It's only by being able to look at de-identification methodologies and publish freely on those de-identification methodologies that we can find out whether or not re-identification is a likelihood. The problem is that re-identification tends to be cumulative right? You have a relatively sanitized data set that gets released. Maybe the NHS figures out how to release information about who gets prescribed what. And then Uber has a breach. And all of a sudden, you know who went to the hospital where those drugs were prescribed and what address they left. Or you know who went to the chemist where the prescriptions were filled. And it becomes much easier to re-identify a data set that had previously been thought to be de-identified. Indeed, if there's a hole in the way that we address damages in privacy breaches, it's that we assume that all the harm from a privacy breach are the identifiable harms from just that data set, but not what might happen when that data set is merged with other data sets down the road. This is how you get the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times a couple of years ago around Christmas reporting on a rash of house thefts, not house burglaries, but identity thieves waiting until the owners of a house have gone out of town, using enough documents to get a duplicate data given to them by the land registry, and then flogging their house while they're out of town. So when Home Depot loses 80 million credit card numbers and pays 30 cents per customer in remediation along with 6 months of credit management for all of those people they've harmed, we really have underpriced the cost of that breach. I mean, realistically, what we should be doing is adding up all the real estate those 80 million people own, and charging Home Depot 1% of that number against the expected losses in total once those data sets are merged. So we need to be able to look, we need to be able to report. In the same way, if you're worried about Facebook manipulating you or offering different offers to people through racial discrimination, this is a big concern in the US where there's law that attempts to redress a generation of discriminatory lending against African Americans, and it's against the law to advertise financial products differentially to people based on their perceived race. The only way you can find out, well, there's two ways you can find out. One is you can convince a regulator to go and audit Facebook and then hope they're good at it. The other way you can do it is you can create multiple synthetic identities that you feed to Facebook to find out whether or not Facebook is dealing with people in an even-handed way, or whether or not Facebook's advertisers are dealing with people in an even-handed way, because Facebook has either deliberately or as a result of their scale blinded themselves to what their advertisers are doing. And so you need the ability to study it. But we have structural impediments to that, whereas on the one hand, in re-identification, you have people proposing bans on re-identification. With Facebook, you have enforceable user license agreements, where in various territories and to varying degrees, those license agreements are considered to be contractual, and people who violate the terms run the risk of both civil and, in some cases in the US, criminal liability for overstepping the terms of a license agreement. This doesn't stop Facebook from discriminating, it just stops us from knowing about it so that we can demand better. And if you do hope that a regulator will go and audit Facebook and do a good job of it, it might help if you have a lot of evidence that there's something worth auditing before they turn up. And then in the realm of the Internet of Things, we keep hearing about these horrific breaches, but we also keep hearing that Internet of Things companies delight in suing and threatening security researchers and reporters who describe the defects that give rise to these breaches before they come about. So I don't know how to make that baby monitor that records all those intimate moments and is connected to the internet secure, but I do know that any impediment to revealing the defects in that baby monitor is not going to help make it more secure. And any terms of service, any rules about technical protection measures, or any other structural impediment that gets in the way of reverse engineering that device, finding out how it works, and then reporting on it in the way that you believe will get action, not allowing firms to set the terms. Firms are not good custodians of bad news about their products for what should be pretty obvious reasons. So we shouldn't let firms set the terms on which we get to report the defects in their products. They shouldn't have causes of action for true facts about what they do. We shouldn't be blinded by claims that there's such a thing as a legitimate security researcher who accords themselves according to a professional ethic. You are a security researcher if you know a fact about security and you tell someone else about it. That's the only criteria that matters for determining whether or not someone is a security researcher. So again, if we're going to do Internet of Things privacy well, the first thing we need to do is make sure that anyone who knows a true fact about how an Internet of Things device is compromising your privacy can tell you about it. But then there's the right to reconfigure, the right to change how these things work once you know how they work, once someone has told you about their defects, once someone's told you a reason you should be worried. And again, we have copyright, contract, patents, and other impediments, both legal and technical, that stand in the way of people who know how to make better tools, imposing those tools between the users and the firms that made the services or the devices, so that the users can get more enjoyment out of their devices. You know, when Facebook started, one of the ways that they were able to contend with MySpace, which at the time had total market dominance, was they offered a tool to their users that allowed their users to have a robot log into MySpace on their behalf, grab all the messages waiting for them on MySpace and bring them into Facebook, and then reply to them on Facebook and send them back to MySpace with a little footer that said, I sent this from Facebook, why don't you leave MySpace now? I mean, in more polite language. Facebook just successfully sued a competitor for doing that. In the era of the tech lash, it's fashionable to say that toolsmiths engage in a kind of simplistic thinking called solutionism, where we look at a technical problem and we say, we'll just make another technology to fix it. But there's a place for technology in fixing this. And with the right to reconfigure, the right to change how our tools work, we can push back against bad conduct by firms. And we can discipline them in ways that are complementary to regulation, that are complementary to discussions about what should be normatively all right. By making tools like, say, an ad blocker, you change the calculus about what ads get made. You know, we forget that in the early days of the web, we had a scourge of pop-up ads, and they were everywhere. And they were obnoxious beyond all measure. I mean, if you think today's advertising is gross, all of today's advertising gross stuff happens where you can't see it. Pop-up ads, they did it all where you could see it. They would autoplay music, they were 1 pixel wide, they ran away from your cursor, and when you close them, they opened 3 more. And Mozilla shipped a pop-up blocker that was on by default, as did Opera, and just started using them. And then advertisers just stopped demanding pop-up ads. Not because a regulator told them they had to stop, but because no one saw them anymore. Right now, there's a place for a regulator to tell people to stop being creepy, but there's also a place for toolsmiths to create the tools that stop creepiness. Because software tools are also a thing that's new in the world. Software tools take the expertise of someone who is skilled, and they encapsulate it in a self-performing recipe. A recipe that you only need to know how to press go to make it run. We've had hammers and saws and food processors and cars for years and years and years, centuries, millennia, but we've never had this. We've never had a thing that could take all of that expertise and boil it down to a recipe that you put into a general purpose computer, press go, and someone very skilled appears as a kind of personal genie and does what they're good at for you, and then disappears again, having encapsulated that expertise in code. We need to be able to audit code to make sure it works. Code is complicated and hard to get right, but code does something useful that nothing else can do. And so we need to have the right to write new code. So Facebook, and Google and Twitter and the other platforms, they've optimized around something called engagement. And engagement is just how long you use the service. And by optimizing for this, they've produced these services that, to refer to what the minister said earlier, they actively reduce our enjoyment of them while increasing how much we use them. Right? In fact, one of the ways to increase how much you use a service is to convince you to argue with people over it, right? And to go away angry so that you come back the next day to argue with someone some more. Now, I recently experienced the pointy end of this. I'm sure, like many of you, I have had some news cycle anxiety in the last couple of years. It's been a hell of a ride. And the last thing I do before I leave the house in the morning to walk my daughter to school every morning is I tap in the search bar on my phone and I type in Burbank weather to get the weather and find out whether she needs a jacket. And Google changed the default behavior of that search bar so that when you tapped in it, it gave you trending searches that had been chosen to increase the likelihood that you would tap on one of them. And inevitably it was Trump threatens nuclear war, right? And then the next one would be, did Trump threaten nuclear war? And the third one would be nuclear war imminent. And I would tap that search bar, and instead of having 15 quiet minutes of reflection to walk away with my daughter, I would spend 15 minutes worrying that I would be dead by the time I got home. It really significantly reduced my enjoyment by making me want to use the product more. So I was able to reconfigure it. It turns out that buried very, very, very deep in Google settings is a thing to turn this off. And so I turned it off, and it revolutionized my life. There is that configuration, that configurability is a really important part of how we're going to break out of this conundrum, how we're going to be able to keep the parts of the technology we want and jettison the parts we don't by pushing back directly. You know, Facebook, if you've looked at their privacy dashboard over the years, there's great animations of its evolution. You'll see something that starts to resemble a casino game. There's a rule of thumb among people who design proposition bets, which are bets that have complicated odds and payouts, is that anytime someone adds complexity to a proposition bet, it's to distort your ability to understand whether the odds are commensurate with the payouts. And so every time Facebook adds 6 more checkboxes to your privacy dashboard, it's to make it harder to figure out which boxes you should check off so that you just leave it at the defaults. But imagine if someone very skilled from a privacy advocacy organization could come up with a recommended set and then write a tool that logged into Facebook on your behalf and gave you the recommended set with one click. They encapsulate their expertise, you press go, and off it goes. Immediately, millions of people could push back against Facebook and their changes. Right? That is a direct way in the world that we can change things. So between these 3 rights, the right to study, the right to talk, the right to change things, we have it in our power to change technology. And we need to be able to change technology to get more than what we're given. Because even if you're not interested in technology, to paraphrase Lenin, technology is very interested in you. So the right question to ask is not which technology do we have, but which technology do we want? And so as a science fiction writer, I get asked whether I think we'll have a better future or a worse future. And as a science fiction writer, I'm keenly aware that I have no business predicting the future, and so I don't try. Instead of predicting the future, I try to have hope for the future. And hope is the belief that you can make a change that will improve the world in some way, that will give you a new vantage point from which you may see a new change that you can make to improve the world in some way. And in this stepwise fashion, one step at a time, we can approach some kind of better world. Technology is not a thing we're going to get right. It's a fight that we will commit ourselves to forever, because technology is eating the world. The general purpose computer is infusing itself into every domain of our activity. We're not going to get it right the first time. People who have dumb ideas will find those ideas ascendant repeatedly. And so we're going to have to be able to change things in order to make them better.